Picture a quiet, tense moment in a living room in a Cambodian neighborhood. This is a place where the high school graduation rate hovers at barely 20%.
Oh.
Yeah. And in the center of the room sits a young man named Tren. By every metric of the American dream, Tren is, he's the hero of the story. His father works construction. His family is scrapped for every single dollar.
He did everything right.
Everything. And Tren responded by becoming valedictorian with a perfect GPA. He did everything the system asked of him. So now he opens the email from Harvard.
The big moment.
The expectation is just palpable. This is supposed to be the payoff for all those years of grit. But instead of an acceptance, he sees a rejection.
Ugh.
And here is where the whole narrative just fractures. You might assume, okay, Tren simply wasn't good enough. But if you look closer at the data, applicants with his exact test scores, his exact socioeconomic background, they were admitted.
So what was the difference?
They just happened to belong to different racial groups. Tren was filtered out because he checked the box for Asian American, a demographic that makes up 20% of Harvard's student body.
Did that statistic hide so much?
It hides a bitter irony. Tren isn't from the wealthy, highly educated enclaves that drive those numbers. He's Cambodian American. That's a subgroup where only 20%, just like his neighborhood's graduation rate, possess a bachelor's degree.
Which is far below the national average.
Far below. So, to the admissions algorithm, he was just another overrepresented Asian. But in reality, he was an anomaly who overcame massive statistical odds, only to be blocked by a policy that was designed, in theory, to help the disadvantaged.
That disconnect is profound. The broad stroke of race versus the granular reality of an individual life, it creates this sense of betrayal.
It really does. And it raises a difficult question. How can we support a system that claims to champion diversity, while at the same time, it renders the struggles of someone like Tren completely invisible? To answer that, we can't just yell about fairness. We have to look at the math, specifically a concept called Bayesian probability.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive. We're analyzing how these policies, designed to address historical inequality, inevitably create new, highly complex problems.
We are going to explore the legal arguments, introduce that mathematical way to define equality, and examine the profound psychological toll these systems take on the very students they're intended to help.
It's an essential conversation, especially now. The legal and moral arguments are at an inflection point. The recent cases against Harvard and UNC, they expose these deep, irreconcilable cracks in how we define and pursue equality.
So let's just jump right in. Let's unpack that legal clash. The challenge went all the way to the Supreme Court, and it centered on the idea that race-based admissions violate two foundational pillars of U.S. law.
Right. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
And when you dig into the arguments, you see these two completely distinct philosophies emerge. The sources call them the colorblind argument and the anti-subordination argument.
And they are fundamentally at war with each other. The colorblind view, which has gained a lot of traction, asserts that the government and any institution getting federal funds, so, major universities, they have to remain absolutely neutral.
Completely neutral.
It demands we forbid all forms of discrimination based on race, period. So the law shouldn't distinguish between discrimination against a group and preferences for a group. It's all just sorting by race, and that's forbidden.
That concept that the law must be strictly neutral, it sounds so simple, almost morally obvious on the surface. But then it gets really complex when the courts apply what they call strict scrutiny. For you, the listener, strict scrutiny is the highest level of judicial review. The government basically has to prove the policy is absolutely necessary. So where did these race-conscious policies fail under that legal microscope?
Well, they had to satisfy two criteria. First, a compelling governmental interest. A goal so important it justifies using a racial classification.
And the universities argued they had one.
They did. They claimed goals like training future leaders or promoting a robust marketplace of ideas. The court actually found those interests to be compelling, so they passed the first test.
So the goal was okay, but the method was the problem.
Exactly. The second requirement is that the means have to be narrowly tailored to achieve that goal. And this is where the whole thing fell apart.
How so?
The goals themselves, like a robust marketplace of ideas, were deemed too elusive. They weren't measurable. The court basically asked, how can we tell when you've achieved it? If we can't tell when the goal is met, how do we know when the policy can stop?
Yeah, there's no concrete benchmark.
No. Is it a certain percentage? Is it a change in leadership demographics after graduation? Because the universities relied on these vague societal benefits instead of, hard numbers, the court said the policy wasn't narrowly tailored. It was too blunt an instrument.
And this connects right into the problem of stereotyping and the lack of a clear exit strategy, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The narrowly tailored failure was made worse by two other issues. First, promoting stereotyping. The challengers argued that when you use these broad, kind of arbitrary racial categories—
like lumping all Asian students together?
Exactly. Or putting wildly diverse groups under Hispanic, you're operating on what they called the offensive and demeaning assumption that students of a particular race think alike. And you shouldn't achieve diversity by promoting stereotypes.
And the second issue goes back to a previous case, Grutter v. Bollinger.
That's right. The Grutter case, back in 2003, it allowed race as a factor, but it emphasized that these programs must have a logical endpoint.
There was a time limit, wasn't there?
There was an expectation. The court back then envisioned these preferences wouldn't be necessary in about 25 years, which put the unofficial expiration date around 2028.
So the new challenge basically said, hey, time's almost up.
Right. They argued that 2 decades had passed, and the universities had no real plan or metric to end the practice. Without that logical endpoint, the deviation from equal treatment was becoming permanent, and that violates the whole principle of equal protection.
Okay, so on one side you have the colorblind advocates. They demand process equality, strict neutrality right now, regardless of history. But on the other side of this enormous philosophical divide is the anti-subordination argument, which is all about that history and the persistence of inequality today.
The anti-subordination view just fundamentally rejects the idea that the country can be colorblind right now. Proponents insist we have to look at race precisely because our history created these radically unequal starting points.
They're pointing to slavery, Jim Crow.
And even more modern government policies. It's not just ancient history.
Can you give us some detail on those modern policy effects? It's easy to think of Jim Crow as something distant, but the structural disadvantages, they really lasted for generations.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the systematic denial of wealth-building opportunities. After World War II, the GI Bill was this incredible engine for home ownership and education.
Right.
But the benefits were often administered locally and systematically denied to Black veterans. At the same time, you had federal housing policies like the FHA codifying redlining,
which is basically drawing a red line around non-white neighborhoods and refusing to give them federally backed mortgages.
Exactly. And that denied them access to the primary way American families build generational wealth: home equity. So even hardworking Black families just couldn't build assets at the same rate, and those disparities echo right down to today.
The numbers shared in the legal challenges really underscore how persistent those gaps are.
They paint a stark picture. As of recent data, the median Black family wealth was around $24,000.
$24,000.
Compared to $188,000 for the median white family. That is a gulf-sized gap. You cannot explain that away by just saying, oh, it's differences in individual hard work.
It's not just wealth.
Not at all. Health disparities are just as shocking. Black women are still 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. This shows that racial inequality isn't a historical footnote. It is a persistent, deadly reality today.
So the anti-subordination argument is that if society is racially unequal, ignoring race won't equalize it. In fact, ignoring it just locks in the status quo built by discrimination.
That is the ultimate tension. The colorblind view says, stop sorting by race and eventually the gaps will close.
And the anti-subordination view says?
It says the gaps are too deep. They were institutionalized over centuries. They require institutional targeted intervention to equalize. The core belief is that acknowledging inequality is the first step to achieving true equality.
This philosophical split, it sets us up perfectly for the mathematical debate. We're moving from abstract law to formal logic. The question becomes the equality of what?
Exactly. Does equality mean everyone is treated the same, or that everyone has the same opportunity regardless of the obstacles they face?
And this is where Bayesian probability comes in to define these ideas with some rigor.
Right. The debate really hinges on 2 definitions: formal equality versus proportional equality. Let's start with the one that aligns with that colorblind mandate. Formal equality.
Formal equality seems pretty straightforward. It just means equal treatment, right?
Yeah.
The same standard for everyone.
That's the idea. It advocates for the same probability of success, P, success, for all individuals, completely ignoring their social background. But let's use an analogy to show why this fails. Imagine two runners, person A and person B.
Okay.
Formal equality says they should both have the same probability of winning the race. But person A lives next to the stadium and has a professional coach. Person B has to walk 5 miles every morning just to find a safe place to run and works 2 jobs to afford shoes.
So by demanding the same probability of success, you're just masking the huge disadvantage person B starts with.
Precisely. The flaw of formal equality is that when you guarantee equal success, regardless of background, the system fails because the backgrounds are inherently unequal. It pretends unequal starting points are equal.
And this is where the math helps prove the need for the other definition, proportional equality.
Yes. Let's spend a minute here because it's a powerful idea. Proportional equality isn't defined by the absolute success rate. It's defined by a conditional probability.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means this. The probability of success, given the social background and the degree of hard work, plus other factors, is the same for every individual in society.
The key phrase there is given the social background. So if person B overcomes their massive disadvantages, low social background, but high hard work and succeeds, that achievement is actually more impressive than person A getting the same result with all their advantages.
That is the core insight. The system has to account for the context. And we can use Bayes' theorem, which is all about relating these conditional probabilities, to show this rigorously.
So if a university admissions process just uses a purely formal standard, say a perfect GPA, a certain test score, without factoring in the social obstacles someone overcame to get there, they're inherently favoring the person who started with more advantages.
Absolutely. The source material argues that when you force the raw probability of success to be the same, the math shows that the person with the lower social status is always at a disadvantage, even if they have the same talent and work ethic. Formal equality, by treating unequal inputs the same, just maintains the inequality.
So the goal of proportional equality is to use some kind of intervention, like affirmative action, to adjust the evaluation process.
Exactly. To adjust it so that the probability of success, given an individual's effort and their starting point, ends up the same for everyone. It justifies active intervention to achieve true equality of opportunity, not just equality of process.
Which brings us right back to the enormous institutional and personal costs that come up when these goals are implemented, using these imperfect, broad racial categories.
That is exactly where the crisis of legitimacy begins. Because the moment students feel the system is prioritizing group identity over their individual merit, it forces them into behavior that undermines the whole idea of a meritocracy.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's focus on the really problematic incentive structures these policies create. We started with trend. How has the implementation of race-conscious policies created these perverse incentive structures, leading to a crisis of legitimacy?
The devastating irony for Tren is that his incredible success was interpreted by the system through this blunt lens of Asian American, a category that is statistically seen as overrepresented.
Right.
The system completely failed to see his specific, highly disadvantaged background as a Cambodian American.
So he had achieved proportional equality through sheer grit, only to be rejected by a system that was supposedly seeking proportional equality, but at this broader, clunkier group level.
And this led to a painful and, frankly, a cynical response from him. He felt forced to compromise his genuine passions just to differentiate himself. He realized that great grades and a strong work ethic just weren't enough because he looked like a statistical duplicate of others in his racial box.
So he drops things he actually enjoys, like playing the violin for cynical activities, starting a club he didn't care about just to manufacture a narrative for the admissions office.
And think about the message that sends to a 17-year-old. The system is telling you, your authentic passion and talent are irrelevant if they fit a stereotype. You have to create an inauthentic identity profile to get an edge.
That's the death of meritocracy.
It is. The focus shifts from developing excellence to mastering strategic identity performance.
And maybe the most jarring example of this is the expectation for students to sell trauma in their personal essays.
This is profound ethical failure. Students from disadvantaged backgrounds are being advised to mine their family's painful history of refugee trauma or their poverty to basically exploit their family's suffering for an admissions edge.
It's transactional and exploitative.
Deeply.
When the sources describe students feeling dirty after submitting an essay like that, what does that say about the institution's moral contract with them?
It suggests the contract is broken before they even set foot on campus. The student feels they've sold a piece of their identity, a piece rooted in pain, rather than being accepted on their merits. And that undermines the trust you need for a healthy learning environment. You're breeding a generation of future leaders defined by cynicism.
That broken trust and that focus on group identity, that carries over directly onto the campus itself. It can lead to some really deep social divisions.
That's right. The policies designed to create a diverse community can sometimes inadvertently lead to social fragmentation.
So let's investigate that. To what extent do these race-conscious policies contribute to social anomie and balkanization, undermining the universalist principles you need for a high-trust society?
This is the concept of social anomie mixed with balkanization. Anomie is a lack of shared ethical standards. On a campus, it's the loss of the shared norm, which should be intellectual merit, because it's been replaced by identity criteria.
And when that happens, students retreat.
They retreat into known, safe, distinct groups. That's balkanization. Instead of seeing a peer as a fellow scholar, they start seeing them as a representative of a political or demographic category.
And that's what creates the suspicion trap, right?
It creates a deeply corrosive atmosphere. Think about students like Jane, who worked incredibly hard, or Jalen, who felt the heat of glances every time he raised his hand in class. Jane's peers might doubt her legitimacy. Jalen might feel that others are attributing his presence to the policy, not his intelligence.
And that suspicion is silent, but it's pervasive. It's the quiet question. Did you get in because of your grades or because of the policy?
And that silent doubt is devastating. It undermines the entire goal of the policy, which was to unite the campus. Instead, it gives students a reason to doubt the validity of each other's presence, so they retreat into racial tribes for safety. It becomes impossible to build a high-trust, integrated community.
This leads to that general critique of identity politics, that participants become partial only to their own identity and militant toward others.
That's the classic critique, yeah. That it creates a zero-sum us versus them mentality.
But our sources make a really crucial distinction here. This tendency is what the theory of intersectionality was specifically developed to solve.
That is a critical point of nuance. Intersectionality was intended to fix the blind spots of early identity politics. It recognizes that no one has a single static identity.
Multiple identities, race, class, gender, they all interact at the same time.
Exactly. A person can be marginalized in one way, say race, while being privileged in another, like class. The experience of a wealthy black man is fundamentally different from a poor black woman, even though they share a racial identity.
So instead of retreating into one tribe, intersectionality forces you to recognize a more complex picture.
It does. It forces a more complex analysis. Proponents say we can see the world as this multi-tiered class hierarchy, where race and gender themselves become kinds of class categories.
So the ultimate goal isn't just to get a few seats at the university table.
The broader goal is to dismantle all the oppressive systems simultaneously: economic, racial, and gender. The historical parallel is that slavery was abolished, but the racist class system that justified it persisted, which led to new symptoms, like disproportionate prison labor. If you only fix the symptom, a new one will just pop up.
It's clear that institutionalizing identity can create cynicism and fragmentation. But even for the students who do get in, there's this immense internal weight they carry, the psychological burden of being seen as a token.
And this takes us right into the heart of the psychological cost, where we have to confront the very controversial mismatch theory and the very real phenomenon of racialized anxiety.
Okay, let's start with that controversial theory. What is the long-term sociological impact on the beneficiaries, specifically regarding this burden of tokenism and the potential mismatch effect?
The mismatch theory suggests that large racial preferences can place some students into institutions that are significantly more competitive than they might have attended otherwise. The environment, therefore, is potentially too rigorous for their level of preparation.
And what are the negative outcomes that proponents of this theory claim?
The argument is really twofold. First, it can lead to underperformance, especially in really tough fields like STEM. Some older studies suggested that students who got a large preference were more likely to drop out of STEM majors.
Because they're being drowned out by peers who are just better prepared coming in.
That's the hypothesis, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The second part is more about a societal stigma. It suggests these policies stamp Black and Hispanic students with a badge of inferiority. And that stigma is corrosive because no one can really distinguish between who succeeded on pure merit and who might have benefited from a policy. It creates this perpetual doubt.
And that doubt leads directly to the fear we heard about with Marcus, the student who was struggling but refused to get help because he didn't want to prove them right, that he was just a diversity pick.
Marcus's story is the perfect illustration of that psychological toll. The anxiety and shame get internalized and it becomes paralyzing. He believed that seeking help would just confirm everyone's worst suspicions about him.
But it's really crucial to note that the mismatch theory itself is heavily, heavily contested, right?
Oh, it is. Critics call it debunked long ago. They cite extensive social science research that found the old studies used flawed data. They argue the evidence just doesn't support the idea of widespread academic harm.
So there's counter-evidence.
There is. Counter-evidence suggests the opposite is true. Attending a more selective school is associated with higher graduation rates and higher lifetime earnings for underrepresented minority students. The benefits of that environment, better resources, better networking, often outweigh any initial academic gap.
Okay, so whether the academic harm is statistically proven or not, the perception of being a token is a very real psychological weight. Let's dig into that, what the sources call tokenism.
Tokenism is when a member of a distinctive group is treated differently, subjecting them to greater pressure to perform at a higher standard. Because they're one of the few, they face this intense scrutiny to represent their entire group.
That constant visibility must be exhausting.
It leads to heightened anxiety, stress, exhaustion, guilt, and shame. It's this internal battle where your failure isn't just your own, it's seen as a failure of the group you represent.
That is a heavy cross to bear.
And this stress is strongly linked to what's called the imposter phenomenon, or IP, the feeling of being an intellectual phony despite clear success. But for racially minoritized groups, it's not just internal self-doubt.
It's being triggered by the external environment.
Exactly. Researchers have reconceptualized it as racialized imposter phenomenon, RIP. This captures the self-doubt that's driven by experiences with racial oppression and inequity. Things like daily microaggressions, racial isolation, the expectation of being a token. These are powerful external precursors.
So the root cause is external discrimination, not just personal insecurity.
Precisely. It's an external burden, not an internal pathology. And that has massive implications for how you support these students.
Standard therapy designed for general anxiety might just miss the mark entirely.
Right. Traditional approaches might treat the symptoms, but they fail to account for the unique race-based external drivers. So interventions have to be culturally tailored.
What does a culturally tailored intervention look like?
It involves incorporating group-specific cultural factors and histories of strength. For African American youth, it might mean using faith-based coping mechanisms or, combating the pressure of the Black superwoman myth, this expectation of unachievable strength that prevents people from being vulnerable.
So you have to address this specific cultural context.
You have to. For Asian Americans, research has found high levels of shame associated with IP. So you need approaches that help externalize that stress and shame, linking it back to the oppressive environment rather than letting it be internalized as a personal failure.
We've laid out a pretty detailed map of this issue. We have the deep philosophical divide, the cynical incentives, the social fragmentation, and these severe psychological costs. It all forces the ultimate question: is race the right tool to achieve proportional equality? Or are there better, more precise ways to do it?
And that's the core argument from opponents of these policies. They say the mechanism itself, the broad racial category, is just fundamentally flawed. It's too imprecise, too arbitrary.
And that imprecision is exactly what led to the injustice that Trent faced.
Right.
So how are these current racial categories criticized as being imprecise and arbitrary?
They're criticized for being both overbroad and under-inclusive. The most famous example is Asian American. It's vastly overbroad. It lumps wealthy, highly educated East and South Asians who drive up the statistics with economically struggling Southeast Asian subgroups.
Like Cambodian Americans, Osmog Americans.
Exactly. Groups with much lower college attainment rates. So by using the broad category, the policy actually penalizes students like Trent, who are anomalies of success within their struggling communities.
And the categories are just as flawed for other groups.
Absolutely. The Hispanic category covers people of Spanish ancestry who may have high economic standing, but also indigenous people from rural Mexico with huge linguistic and economic barriers. The white category sweeps in people of Welsh, Moroccan, Lebanese, Iranian descent groups with totally different histories.
These were just bureaucratic labels.
They were devised by bureaucrats in the 70s for data collection, not for determining eligibility for anything. Yet they became the rigid basis for sorting people.
So, given these flawed categories, opponents argue that race-neutral alternatives could achieve the goal of diversity without all these negative consequences.
Yeah.
What's the most prominent alternative they propose?
The most immediate and powerful one is to focus on eliminating or drastically reducing preferences that predominantly benefit wealthy non-minority applicants, specifically the ALDC categories.
ALDC being athletes, legacy, donor-related, and children of faculty.
Precisely. And the data on this is just staggering. At Harvard, ALDC applicants are less than 5% of the applicant pool, but they make up around 30% of those who get admitted.
30%.
And the overwhelming majority are white and wealthy. If you just reduce those massive preferences, which are a form of affirmative action for the privileged, you instantly open up thousands of spots.
And has there been research suggesting that one action alone could achieve the diversity goals?
Yes. Studies suggest that just reducing the legacy and donor preferences could nearly replicate the current racial diversity levels, all while being strictly colorblind. The argument is simple. Why use a legally fraught racial filter when you can just cut preferences for the powerful?
That seems intuitively fairer. To address poverty directly through, say, a socioeconomic-focused affirmative action.
SE-focused AA is the other big proposal. You give preference based directly on a student's socioeconomic background, their poverty level, family education history, neighborhood disadvantage, instead of using race as a proxy.
So it benefits poor applicants of all races. Poor Chinese Americans, poor Latin Americans, poor white Americans.
Exactly. It avoids the prediction failures that hurt Tren.
But implementing a system like that is way more complicated than it sounds. What are the practical challenges?
There are huge hurdles. First, the political challenge. People are often more resistant to being classified by wealth than by race. Then there's the definition problem. What is socioeconomic background? Is it annual income, total net worth, which captures generational wealth, zip code?
And how do you even verify that information honestly?
Verification is a really sticky issue. How do universities check total net worth? Wealthy applicants might have an incentive to misrepresent their holdings. And even if you solve that, a purely economic system might still miss racial disparities that aren't just about income. A Black applicant and a white applicant with the same low income can face vastly different structural barriers.
So it might improve class diversity, but still fall short on racial equality.
It's a real risk. Race and class are just so intertwined in unique ways.
Finally, we have to circle back to the Tren paradox and the incredibly complex position of Asian Americans in this whole debate. They were the plaintiffs against Harvard, framed as the victims, yet the debate inside the community is deeply nuanced.
The internal dilemma is acute. The core issue, as we've seen, is that lower-income Asian American subgroups are penalized by that generalized model minority statistic generated by more successful subgroups. Their struggles are just made invisible.
And yet, despite the potential harm to their own admissions rates, some Asian Americans actively support affirmative action policies. What's the rationale there?
There are two main reasons. First, the principle of proportional equality. For those who believe deeply in correcting systemic inequality across society, supporting AA aligns with that fundamental moral principle, even if it might cost their community a few seats at Harvard.
They see it as a collective societal debt.
Exactly. The second reason is self-interest, but in other contexts. Asian Americans recognize that while they might be overrepresented in undergrad engineering, they face significant discrimination elsewhere. The bamboo ceiling.
The barrier preventing Asian Americans from reaching senior executive roles or being underrepresented in entertainment or sports leadership?
Correct. Data shows they get hired into technical roles, but struggle to get promoted. So the argument is that affirmative action policies could be necessary to achieve equality in these non-academic sectors. Figures like Jeremy Lin in basketball or Hassan Minhaj in comedy become these really crucial examples, showing that success is possible in fields where they're traditionally excluded.
So it's not just about college admissions, it's about tackling discrimination across the board.
That's the broader fight. And if we step outside the U.S. for a moment, we see other major nations grappling with the same thing, which confirms this is a global challenge.
Right. There's an example from China.
There is. In China, there's a policy providing preferential treatment in college admissions for ethnic minority groups. The goal is to promote educational access and socioeconomic development for historically marginalized ethnic groups. Now, the mechanism is different, but the intent is shared, using group identity as an intervention to address disparities. It proves every complex society is struggling with this paradox.
This deep dive has covered a vast, complex landscape. We started with a profound betrayal felt by Tren, the student filtered out by a blunt racial category. We then moved through the legal war between colorblind and anti-subordination philosophies.
And used Bayesian math to show that proportional equality requires you to acknowledge unequal starting points.
We saw how, in practice, This intervention can generate corrosive cynicism, forcing students to sell trauma or perform inauthentic identities.
An atmosphere that fuels social anomie and suspicion on campus and inflicts the severe psychological burden of racialized imposter phenomenon.
And finally, we explored the alternatives.
Yeah.
We concluded that while race-neutral approaches, like eliminating preferences for the wealthy and focusing on socioeconomic status, they seem more precise.
They face these immense hurdles in implementation, definition, and verification. The core challenge really remains. How do you design a system that is granular enough to see the struggle of an individual like Tren, but powerful enough to correct for centuries of structural inequality?
The conclusion we can draw from analyzing all this is that the question is no longer just if we should intervene to equalize opportunity, but how. How do we ensure any solution is meticulously granular, measurable, and ultimately advances the cause of genuine equal opportunity?
Without simply replacing one form of injustice, which is systemic racial oppression, with another. Institutionalized invisibility and a heavy psychological burden, the only acceptable goal is a system that allows students to succeed based on their authentic achievements and passions.